Number 8. Roxana Sakori. Lauren and Jeff Sakori thought they were giving their 3 adopted children from Poland a better life by bringing them to the United States and raising them in Wayne County, Michigan. They went out of their way to ensure that the kids had a safe and stable upbringing so that they wouldn't worry about the painful realities they'd faced in Poland. But one of the kids, Roxana, struggled with painful memories and other trauma. And like most teens, she didn't open up to her parents about her inner feelings. Instead, she turned to the internet, where she met an older man named Michael Rivera in 2014. There are different versions of what happened next, depending on who you ask. Rivera was facing legal trouble due to the age gap between him and Roxana. Some people believe he manipulated his younger girlfriend into hatching a plot to murder her family so they couldn't cooperate with the case against him. Others think that the couple worked together to plan a massacre of Roxana's family and that they were both equally responsible in the scheme. Shortly after 2 a.m. one October morning, Roxana cut her brother's throat. He survived, and the plot to kill the entire household was thwarted when another family member saw what was happening, screamed, and woke everyone up. Roxana Sakori and Michael Rivera were charged in connection with the crime, including the parts of the sinister plot that they failed to carry out. Prosecutors made it clear that they planned to hold Roxana accountable to the fullest extent of the law, despite her parents' plea for leniency and mental health treatment as an alternative to prison. As far as the state was concerned, Roxana was capable of making her own decisions and deserved to be treated accordingly under the law. The Sakoris blamed the bulk of the murderous plan on Rivera, believing that he'd influenced their daughter to agree to something she would have never otherwise even thought about doing. A lot of people agreed with them, while many others sided with the prosecution's heavy-handed approach. The one thing that most people agreed on was the fact that Rivera deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars, and they got their wish in 2015. A jury convicted him on 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and 1 count each of assault with the intent to murder, using a computer to commit a crime, and assault with a dangerous weapon. Roxana begrudgingly took a plea deal and admitted to 1 count of assault with intent to murder in exchange for having the other 6 counts against her dropped, and as a result, she was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, far shorter than the life sentence she could have faced if she'd been found guilty on all counts. During her sentencing hearing, Roxana stared at the floor as her lawyer spoke to the judge. When it was her turn to talk, she offered a tearful apology to her family. After struggling to get the words out between sobs, she broke down completely. She later withdrew her guilty plea and tried to get a new trial, but ultimately dropped the appeal. And since then, no changes have been made to her conviction or sentence. Do you think it would be fair to extend leniency toward Roxana due to her mental health struggles and young age, or does she deserve to be held accountable as an able-minded adult who is fully aware of the wrongness of their depraved actions? Let us know in the comments below. Number 7. Sha Del Jackson. A 21-year-old University of Wisconsin student named Nathan Potter was walking to his Milwaukee apartment early one morning in 2009 when a young man approached and tried to rob him. Potter had no money, so the thief shot him out of anger, and unfortunately, he died from his injuries. Witnesses implicated 2 men in the crime, along with another shooting that happened later that day. 19-year-old Derek J. Thomas and 18-year-old Sha Del Jackson. Apparently, Thomas acted as a lookout while Jackson pulled the trigger. Jackson was still at large when police caught up with Thomas. During questioning, he claimed that Jackson had contacted him before the shooting, saying he wanted to commit a robbery because he needed money and had a gun. After shooting Potter and leaving him to die on the sidewalk, the suspects fled to Thomas's home nearby and played video games. Thomas admitted that he and Jackson targeted Potter at random while casing a nearby tavern. The 2 parties didn't know each other, which means that Potter was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. In early 2010, Derek Thomas pleaded guilty to felony murder. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, followed by 8 years of supervised release. A jury then convicted Sha Del Jackson of participating in Potter's murder and, as a consequence, he was sentenced to life in prison. He also received a 5-year sentence for the second shooting, which left a man injured. During Jackson's sentencing hearing, his attorney urged the judge to consider his young age and his lack of impulse control. The judge was unswayed, though, and when she announced that Jackson would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the young offender erupted into a tirade. He shouted obscenities at the judge, while courtroom deputies struggled to subdue him. While being led out of the courtroom, he smirked at the victim's loved ones and mouthed a nasty word. In the meantime, his supporters taunted Potter's family, and deputies ended up having to pepper spray Jackson to get him under control. Number 6. Nicholas Lindsay. Nicholas Lindsay acquired a serious criminal record at a young age when he was arrested for grand theft in St. Petersburg, Florida in 2010. In February 2011, he fatally shot a police officer during a late-night encounter near Tropicana Field. The incident happened after a resident called 911 and reported seeing a suspicious man in his backyard. Suspecting the man was a burglar, the caller described seeing the suspect standing outside with a brick in his hand before jumping a fence. Officer David Crawford was the first to respond to the call. A second officer then arrived to find him lying on the ground near his patrol vehicle with multiple gunshot wounds. According to reports, Crawford had been shot while reaching for a notepad. Acting on a tip, law enforcement raided Lindsay's home and arrested him the following day. At his mother's urging, he told the truth during questioning and was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. Lindsay's mother, Deneen Sweat, later told local station WFTS that she urged her son to man up and tell what happened. Lindsay's parents were in the interview room with him when he confessed, revealing that he'd thrown the murder weapon in a creek afterward. Much debate followed over whether Lindsay should be tried as an adult, given the nature of the crime. Mayor Bill Foster, who once praised the teen as a troubled youth with the potential to turn his life around, now wanted to see him held accountable the same way anyone over the age of 18 would be. Under Florida's Law Enforcement Protection Act, that meant he'd be looking at an automatic life sentence if convicted. Lindsay was indicted on a first-degree murder charge in early 2011, and he finally went on trial about a year later. His lawyer portrayed him as a scared adolescent and argued that a manslaughter conviction was more appropriate. Prosecutors were quick to point out that all 5 of the shots that were fired struck Crawford, indicating that the shooting was deliberate and therefore qualified as a murder. After being convicted of the murder charge and sentenced to life without parole, Lindsay appealed. It was denied, though, and in 2017, his attorneys asked the court to reduce Lindsay's term to 40 years based on new sentencing guidelines for young people. However, the judge once again upheld the life sentence and said that the court would revisit the possibility of reducing it after he serves 25 years. In footage from the court hearing, Lindsay didn't appear to be paying much attention to the proceeding. And when the judge announced that the life sentence would continue, he could be seen grinning, almost as if he wasn't taking the situation seriously. Number 5. Ethan Orton. 5 months before he turned 18, Ethan Orton's mother told him in an email that he had to move out of their Cedar Rapids, Iowa home by his birthday. More specifically, the message stated that once Ethan was a legal adult, his parents were cutting him out of their lives completely. The following day, on October 14, 2021, police responded to reports of a suspicious person at the residence, and officers arrived to find Ethan sitting outside, covered in blood. He quickly confessed to killing his parents, 41-year-old Misty Scott Slade and 42-year-old Casey Arthur Orton, who were found dead inside the house. Both victims had been attacked in their sleep and stabbed repeatedly with a Bowie knife. And after noticing that his mother had survived the initial attack, Ethan finished her off with an axe. When questioned about his motive, he told police that he committed the murders out of a desire to take charge of his life. He later told a psychologist that the email he'd received from his mother pushed him over the edge. Ethan claimed that both his parents had emotionally abused him all of his life and that he'd reached his breaking point. During his trial, a forensic expert testified that Ethan was further agitated because his father had originally taken his side, only to change his mind and side with Ethan's mother. In early 2023, Ethan pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. But under Iowa case law, it would have been unconstitutional to sentence him to life without parole. Judge Ian Thornhill was unmoved by the defense's claims of abuse and a difficult childhood, though, and he felt it was appropriate to issue the harshest sentence possible. During Ethan's sentencing hearing, Thornhill commented on how there's a difference between a teenager disliking their parents' way of running things and being an actual abuse victim. The judge further remarked on the clearly deliberate nature of the killings, including Ethan's decision to follow through with murdering his mother after he realized that she was still breathing. Thornhill imposed 2 concurrent life sentences with the eligibility of parole after 50 years. This means that the earliest Ethan could see freedom again is at the age of 67. It's also very possible that he won't be released, depending on how the parole board feels when the time comes. When he was given an opportunity to speak, Ethan made some remorseful but somewhat puzzling remarks. He thanked his grandmother and sister for forgiving him and noted that they supposedly had proof of the terrible things he accused his parents of putting him through. The teen killer also said the experience made him learn better, whatever that means, and he said that in hindsight, he thinks his parents could have been rehabilitated. He wished he could take back his decision to murder them, but that he'd come to terms with what happened and the fact that it can't be undone. Number 4. Damon Kemp. During the early morning hours of December 7, 2018, police in Daytona Beach, Florida received a call about a break-in at a local apartment complex. Responding officers came face-to-face with a 19-year-old university student from Florida named Damon Kemp, who was accused of trying to force his way into an apartment at gunpoint. Luckily, though, the resident managed to push him out and lock the door. When police arrived, Kemp allegedly walked toward an officer, ignoring the cop's orders to stop. Responding officers noticed that the young man was soaked and he was rambling nonsensically. And at one point, Kemp shouted, "I killed Ace," which was the nickname of his friend, Trey Ingram. Inside an apartment, police found the bullet-riddled bodies of Ingram and Jordan Payton, who were also both 19 years old, and as a result, Kemp was charged with their murders. Prosecutors accused the young man of shooting the victims in the back with a .40 caliber Glock handgun as they desperately tried to run from him. He then washed the blood off himself and disposed of the murder weapon in a nearby pond. Kemp's lawyer argued that the prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his client was the killer, and that just because Kemp's handprint was on the gun didn't mean he murdered anyone. And in the event the jurors believed Kemp was the shooter, his attorney claimed that there was enough evidence to conclude that he was legally insane when he committed the crime. There was certainly no doubt that Kemp acted strange in the days leading up to the murder. According to his roommate, he believed that the radio was listening to him and made nonsensical comments, including a remark about National Soil Day. The roommate also claimed that Kemp had put him in a chokehold twice while he was driving. Kemp's strange behavior in court also made it clear that he was mentally unstable. On at least one occasion, he was wheeled into the courtroom in restraints while throwing extremely loud screaming tantrums. And during a bond hearing early on in his case, he repeatedly yelled what sounded like the word God. Then he suddenly went silent and stared blankly toward the front of the room before leaning forward in his wheelchair with a seemingly diabolical look on his face. But being mentally ill didn't mean that Kemp was unaware of the difference between right or wrong. According to prosecutors who failed to provide a motive for the double homicide, the evidence was compelling enough on its own. Not to mention, out of the vast array of strange emotions Kemp displayed in court, remorse didn't seem to be one of them. So he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Under Florida law, Kemp faces up to life in prison, yet there was no news of any strange outbursts during his trial or when his conviction was announced. Perhaps he's come to terms with his fate, although if he has anything to say, he'll most likely get the chance when he's officially sentenced. The definition of insanity is much different from a legal perspective than it is from a clinical standpoint, and it's extremely difficult for murder defendants to obtain an insanity ruling in the United States. Consequently, a lot of profoundly mentally ill defendants end up in the prison system, where access to mental health care is minimal at best. Number 3. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. It's normal for high school students to get upset with their teachers from time to time, especially when they think they deserve a better grade on an assignment. But a young man from Fairfield, Iowa named Willard Miller took his anger to a whole new level in November 2021 after learning that he was failing Spanish. Outraged by the poor mark, Miller followed his teacher, 66-year-old Nohema Graeber, to a park that she frequently visited, and he was accompanied by a classmate named Jeremy Goodale. The young man grabbed Graeber and dragged her into a nearby wooded area where they beat her to death with a baseball bat. Then they hid the victim's body beneath a tarp and stole her van. Graeber's remains were found after her family reported her missing the following day. Classmates were quick to point investigators in the direction of Miller and Goodale, and of course the teens were quick to point the finger at one another as the primary actor in the gruesome crime. Miller initially denied hitting Graeber at all with the bat, while Goodale accused his friend of being the mastermind of the disturbing plot. Prosecutors, on the other hand, claimed that both suspects participated in the fatal beating and that they planned the crime up to 2 weeks in advance. Graeber's family was left broken by her death, which occurred just days before her 67th birthday. Her husband died from cancer days before Miller's sentencing hearing, and Graeber's family believes that the heartbreak and stress over the murder is what caused his health to spiral. Instead of moving forward with plans to testify against one another, both young men ultimately decided to take a plea deal in order to avoid a trial. In the end, they each admitted to 1 count of first-degree murder. Miller was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 35 years, while Goodale faces a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. During his sentencing hearing, Miller apologized to Graeber's family. He admitted that he knew what he planned to do was wrong and that he followed through with it anyway. As the gravity of his actions and the reality of his future behind bars sank in, he grew slightly tearful but remained mostly unemotional. The judge was unmoved by Miller's words, so while handing down the sentence, he described the teen as sinister, evil, and brutal. He acknowledged that Miller's young mind wasn't fully developed when the crime occurred, but saw it as no excuse for doing something that was off the charts in terms of the cruelty and violence involved. Miller appealed his sentence shortly after the hearing, and Goodale is scheduled to be sentenced in August 2023. Number 2. Dante Wright. A family's worst nightmare came true on October 4, 2016, when 18-year-old Jordan Klee was found dead from a single gunshot wound in the yard of his Ann Arbor, Michigan home. He'd been killed in a botched robbery attempt by 3 teenagers. 17-year-old Dante Wright was accused of pulling the trigger. His co-conspirators Delreno Gracie and Jamarius Ellison were also charged in connection with the case. By the time Wright's trial rolled around, Gracie and Ellison had already taken plea deals. During pre-trial hearing, he unexpectedly confessed to robbing and killing Klee, hoping to also hop on the plea bargain bandwagon. Prosecutors were on board with the idea, which came with a 25 to 52-year sentence. But the judge almost revoked the deal when Wright grinned during the victim impact statements that Klee's loved ones read in court. As they mustered the strength to face Wright and poured their hearts out, he made a mockery of their pain and suffering. The judge was infuriated by the display and threatened to take the plea agreement off the table and take the case to trial. He then left the decision up to Klee's family, who decided that they wanted to move forward with the plea deal so that they could continue healing from the senseless tragedy. For their own mental and emotional well-being, they forgave Wright despite his despicable behavior. Wright's attorney apologized to the court on his client's behalf, claiming that the young man smiles when he gets nervous. His mother, Antoinette Carter, told MLive.com that she believed her son smiled due to mental health problems. She said that he dealt with everything in life by smiling, but even if that was true, it's understandable that people were bothered by what they saw. At his sentencing hearing, Wright said that he loved his family and that he'd see them soon. He could have personally apologized for the smiling incident, but he chose not to. And while Wright may not languish behind bars until his dying days, he might as well get comfortable because he's going to be in prison until 2042 at the very earliest, while his maximum release date is in 2078. He'll be somewhere between 43 and 70 years old when he sees freedom again. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. Number 1. Payton Gendron. On May 14, 2022, a 19-year-old white supremacist named Payton Gendron drove 200 miles from his home in Conklin, New York, to the city of Buffalo. Armed with an AR-15 style rifle and with a GoPro camera rolling, he walked toward the entrance of a top supermarket in a predominantly African-American neighborhood and opened fire on innocent people who were just going about their day. The carnage began in the parking lot and continued as the deranged mass murderer walked through the store. 10 people were killed and 3 others were injured by the gunshots, leaving Western New Yorkers devastated, terrified, and infuriated by the unprovoked violence. Responding officers convinced Gendron to drop his gun and surrender, but it would later be revealed that he planned to continue killing people if he managed to escape from the first crime scene. He'd planned the massacre months in advance, and while the signs were easy to notice in hindsight, his concerning behavior was overlooked in the years leading up to the shooting, and any opportunities to intervene were missed. Gendron made no efforts to hide his motive for the mass killing. In fact, he droned on about his reasons in a disturbing 180-page manifesto that he released shortly before he committed the horrific act. Further investigation revealed that he spent a vast majority of his time on the internet connecting with people who shared similar hateful beliefs. Both state and federal authorities charged Gendron with dozens of crimes. Then, 5 months after the shooting, he pleaded guilty to 15 state-level charges, including 10 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder motivated by hate, and domestic terrorism motivated by hate. As a result, he received 10 consecutive life sentences in state prison. Gendron listened quietly and looked down at the floor for much of his sentencing hearing, appearing emotionless at some moments and shamefully aware of his unforgivable behavior during others. And while there's no doubt that he's a cold-blooded, heartless killer, even he couldn't hold back tears during some of the most heart-wrenching moments of the victim impact statements. When it was his turn to speak, he apologized to his victims and renounced his extremist beliefs. And while the emotion appeared genuine on some level, many people understandably find it hard to believe that someone who could commit such an unspeakable act of violence in the first place could ever come to truly regret it. More than once throughout the hearing, family members of Gendron's victims struggled to hold back their anger. They should have never had to face the reality of having their loved ones cruelly ripped from them at the hands of a complete stranger who hated his victims for no reason other than the color of their skin. Gendron's federal case is ongoing. He faces 26 hate crime charges and additional gun-related counts, and he could face the death penalty if convicted. But he's definitely going to remain locked up until his dying day, and will thankfully never get to enjoy even a single moment of freedom again.
17. David Chiselton. Public defender Aaron Brockler faced an uphill battle for negotiating any kind of leniency for David Chiselton. His client was accused of assaulting his girlfriend and burning down an apartment building in Cuyahoga County, Ohio in 2019. By then, Chiselton had a mile-long rap sheet that included violent past offenses, and he now faced a multitude of charges including felonious assault and multiple counts of aggravated arson. Brockler and the prosecution reached an agreement that would require Chiselton to plead guilty to several charges in exchange for a sentence of 9 to 100 years. If Chiselton took the deal, it would be up to the judge to decide the sentence. It certainly was no guarantee that he would receive the 9-year minimum. In fact, that was highly unlikely, but it was the best Brockler could do for his client. Chiselton took the deal and hoped for a 9-year sentence. When the judge sentenced him to 47 years, he became infuriated. Blaming his defense attorney for the sentence, Chiselton sucker punched Brockler in the face while in handcuffs, knocking him unconscious. Court officers immediately tackled Chiselton and handcuffed him, this time behind his back rather than in front. Meanwhile, Brockler regained consciousness. He had a broken nose and a concussion. Authorities charged Chiselton with felonious assault, but a jury acquitted him of the charge after his attorney successfully argued that Brockler's injuries weren't serious enough to qualify for a conviction under the charge. Chiselton clapped gleefully after the verdict was read and let out a satisfied hoot as he was being led out of the courtroom. Speaking with the ID channel series Chaos in Court, Brockler said that he and Chiselton had a good relationship up until that point, and that he did everything he possibly could to negotiate the best possible outcome for his client. He was disappointed about the acquittal because he felt it sends the message that people can assault their attorney and get away with it. 16. Alan McCarthy Jr. During a family court hearing in Volusia County, Florida in 2017, 36-year-old Alan McCarthy Jr. was denied custody of his children. During this particular hearing, he was accused of threatening his kids and violating a restraining order. His lengthy criminal history, which spanned at least 3 states and included priors for domestic violence, kidnapping, indecent exposure, and other charges, may have also had something to do with the judge's decision. McCarthy became furious with the judge, Stacia Warren. After the hearing, he dialed 911 and said that he wanted to report a crime that was about to happen. He instructed the dispatcher to bring Judge Warren into the parking lot so he could execute her, and he also threatened the dispatcher. After hanging up, McCarthy called 3 more dispatchers and continued making threats against Warren. He was charged with threatening a public official and was facing up to 40 years in prison if convicted. For the next year, he languished in jail with no bond while awaiting trial. His trial began in 2018 in front of Judge Matt Foxman. McCarthy refused to cooperate with his public defender or wear a suit and tie, so he was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. When the courtroom was ordered to rise at the beginning of the hearing, McCarthy remained seated and gave the judge the middle finger, yelling that he wasn't under oath. He then launched into a verbal tirade about how the court was unfair to him for taking his kids away from him, and he threatened Judge Foxman. The judge asked McCarthy, "Do you want to be here or not?" He replied that he didn't want to be there and that he was being unconstitutionally prosecuted. McCarthy accused the court of violating his rights and basically acted like an armchair legal expert who thought that everyone else was the problem and that his behavior had nothing to do with the situation he was in. Foxman remained calm while court officers surrounded McCarthy just in case something was about to happen. The defendant was ultimately removed from the courtroom and put behind a 2-way mirror, where he was out of sight but could still hear and respond to everything that was going on. He continued to yell and cuss, but the case eventually proceeded. The jury deliberated for just 30 minutes before finding McCarthy guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. 15. Keith Swainson. After receiving criminal mischief complaints one Saturday night in 2016, Houston police responded to the home of 49-year-old Keith Swainson. A 7-hour standoff ensued as officers tried making contact with the suspect. At one point, Swainson opened fire on responding officers through the windows of his house. A police sergeant shot back and was struck by debris from Swainson's gun. After failing to get him to cooperate, a SWAT team deployed tear gas into his home, at which point he finally surrendered. During his initial court hearing 2 days later, Swainson began shouting and swearing at the judge. Someone nearby yelled at Swainson not to talk like that, which only seemed to exacerbate his out-of-control behavior. Disturbing footage of the outburst showed the suspect being led out of the courtroom by multiple law enforcement officials, with what appeared to be dried blood all over the side of his face. When questioned about Swainson's injuries, defense attorney David Parrish II told the press that his client had a right to seek medical care, or not. He further explained that the jail had medical staff who were capable of treating Swainson, and speculated that the defendant hadn't got a chance to seek treatment yet, given the eventful nature of the last few days. The outcome of Swainson's case is unclear, but prison records show that nobody by his name is currently in custody in Texas. 14. Kimberly Castler. When 34-year-old mother of 3 and hairstylist Jolene Cummings disappeared from her workplace in 2018, suspicion fell on her co-worker, Jennifer Seibert. She denied doing anything to harm Cummings, but the evidence quickly stacked up against her. While investigators couldn't find the victim's body, they found evidence of a large amount of blood that had been cleaned up inside the hair salon where the women worked. And surveillance footage showed Kessler throwing out heavy garbage bags outside the building long after her shift ended. She had also gone to Walmart earlier that evening and bought cleaning supplies and an electric knife before returning to the workplace. After finding Jolene's missing SUV and surveillance footage connecting Seibert to where it was left, the police had enough evidence to at least arrest Seibert for stealing the missing woman's car. They picked her up at a rest stop where she was living in her vehicle and questioned her further about Jolene's disappearance while booking her for the vehicle theft charge. In addition to behaving in an overly animated way, Seibert admitted that she'd been living under aliases for 20 years and that her real name was Kimberly Castler. She was eventually indicted on a first-degree murder charge. Over the next year, the court wrestled with the issue of Kessler's mental state and her competency to stand trial. She'd gone on a hunger strike in jail, losing over 100 pounds, and her behavior had become increasingly erratic over time. Corrections officers described having cups of urine thrown at them, being threatened and harassed by Kessler, and finding feces smeared on the walls of her jail cell. Kessler was ruled incompetent to stand trial and sent to a mental hospital for 6 months in an effort to restore her competency so the case could resume. Another year went by and she was transferred back to jail. Her weight continued to drop and her behavior remained out of control. At one point, the sheriff asked the court for permission to force feed her, but she began eating again. After 2 more mental evaluations, the judge ruled Castler competent to stand trial. By then, the prosecutors had begun to speculate that she was exaggerating her condition in hopes of being found not guilty by reason of insanity. When she refused to attend her pre-trial hearings, Castler was strapped to a chair and wheeled in. She screamed and shouted during almost every single court appearance, accusing her former defense attorney of being related to Jolene Cummings. The claim was found to be untrue. On most occasions, Castler was removed from the courtroom so the hearing could proceed. Her displays may have prolonged the cause, but she was eventually forced to face justice. The jury convicted her of Jolene's murder and sentenced her to life without parole. 13. Jacob Larson. Judge John McBain is known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal cases. So, when accused stalker Jacob Larson showed disrespect in the courtroom one day in 2016, things got ugly fast. The victim told the judge that Larson had violated a protective order that Judge McBain had issued on a previous occasion. She said Larson was continuing to contact her despite the order banning communication between the two. To make matters even more disturbing, the woman reminded the judge that she and Larson didn't even know each other, but that he'd pursued her relentlessly after she made it clear she had no interest in him. When McBain asked Larson why he violated the order, he claimed that the victim instigated it by posting attractive photos on social media. The victim told the judge that she had no connections with him on Facebook, Twitter, or any other platform. Frustrated with Larson's apparent lack of cooperation with the protective order, McBain admonished him for his obsessive behavior, reminding him that all he had to do was leave her alone. Larson accused the judge of being buddy-buddy with the victim, once again failing to take responsibility for his actions. McBain sentenced him to 3 days in jail, but Larson continued to talk back. Each time he mouthed off, McBain increased the sentence until finally it reached 93 days. There was only one court officer in the room, and when he tried to handcuff Larson and take him into custody, Larson resisted. A struggle ensued, at which point Judge McBain removed his robe and rushed over. He could be heard instructing the officer to tase his ass right now as he got on the ground to help the officer get Larson under control. They managed to subdue the defendant without tasing him and hauled him off to jail. Sadly, Larson didn't learn from the experience. After serving his 93-day sentence for contempt, he went right back to stalking his victim. He was convicted of aggravated stalking and sentenced to 5 years in prison. 12. Melissa Hardwick. Kentucky Family Court Judge Jennifer Edwards was listening to a man explain why he filed a domestic violence complaint against his estranged wife in 2011 when things suddenly spiraled out of control. The estranged wife, Melissa Hardwick, interrupted her husband and was warned by Judge Edwards to stop or she would face a contempt charge. She disobeyed the order and Edwards made good on her promise, sentencing the woman to 10 days in jail. Hardwick reacted to the punishment by lunging at the judge. Footage of the incident showed Hardwick charging over the bench as nearby court deputies yanked her away. She could be heard yelling at the deputies to get off her as they ordered her to put her hands behind her back and handcuffed her. Hardwick continued to yell obscenities and threatened Judge Edwards as she was dragged out of the courtroom. In the moments following the attempted assault, Edwards appeared slightly shaken as she rummaged through court paperwork. She rescued herself from the case and mentioned her plans to have Hardwick criminally charged for her behavior. What started out as a 10-day punishment against Hardwick for contempt ultimately became a 120-day jail sentence. In addition to the contempt charge, she was accused of making terroristic threats, intimidating a judge, and resisting arrest. Hardwick was sentenced to 5 years of probation and ordered to undergo a mandatory mental health evaluation and anger management courses. As a Cleveland Municipal Court judge mentioned in the ID Channel series Chaos in Court, Hardwick was lucky that the bailiffs intervened quickly enough to stop her from reaching the judge, or she would have faced much more serious charges. 11. Donna Coil. During the summer of 2016, Amanda Coil drunkenly crashed head-on into an SUV in Redford Township, Michigan, killing a 31-year-old man and critically injuring his fiancée. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of operating under the influence causing death and was sentenced to 3 to 15 years in prison. A man in the courtroom laughed and smiled the entire time while a surviving family member of one of the victims delivered an impact statement. Judge Kiana Lillard admonished him for his behavior, calling him a clown, and had him removed from the courtroom. Right after she kicked him out, she had Amanda's mum, Donna Coil, taken away for allegedly laughing and smirking during the hearing. During her disgusted diatribe, the judge addressed Amanda's family directly, stating, "I understand you're all very upset because your loved one is going to prison. But guess what? She's going to prison for the choices that she made." Donna was initially ordered to spend 93 days in jail, but was released the following day after apologizing to Judge Lillard, adding that she'd been under a lot of stress. 10. Jason Clare. One evening in June 2011, Jason Clare made the fateful decision to go to a bar in St. Cloud, Florida that was offering an unbeatable happy hour price of 4 beers for $1. While there, he got into an altercation over a girl with brothers Joel and James Gunn. Clare would later describe being pinned to the ground and brutally beaten by 3 people outside the bar. At some point during the incident, he managed to get a hold of his gun and open fire, killing the Gunn brothers. During police questioning, Clare insisted that he acted in self-defense and out of fear for his life. He was severely injured and claimed that it was from the Gunn brothers beating him before he shot them. Witnesses gave a much different story, painting Clare out as the aggressor and making it sound like the shooting was completely unprovoked. They said that bystanders beat Gunn out of anger after he shot the victims. Authorities charged Clare with murder, and he continued to maintain his innocence based on Florida's Stand Your Ground law. More than 30 relatives on both sides of the case showed up in court for a pre-trial hearing to determine whether Clare had grounds to argue self-defense. To everyone's disappointment, the judge delayed the position due to new evidence that was presented during the hearing. Tensions were high as these 2 groups of people with starkly opposing views on the case filed out of the courtroom and into a narrow hallway toward the building's exit. So, it wasn't too surprising that all hell broke loose when a friend of the Gunn brothers, Jeremy Million, bumped into Clare. The defendant's stepfather, James Parker, immediately challenged Million to a fight. Punches were thrown as the situation devolved into pure chaos, and Parker was soon entangled in a fistfight with the Gunn brothers' father, James Gunn Sr. Bystanders shrieked as deputies tried to break the 2 men up, but they remained fiercely determined to continue beating each other. Parker relentlessly administered one blow after another against his younger and larger opponent, like a vicious guard dog prepared to take down his enemy at all costs. The fight came to a sudden stop when a court officer threatened to tase the men. Both Parker and Gunn were charged with disorderly conduct and banned from attending any further hearings on the case. The charges against the dueling dads were ultimately dismissed, but Claire was convicted of the Cunn brothers' murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 9. Anthony Deese and Jerome Stewart. 59-year-old Dale Williams Sr. of Youngstown, Ohio, was convinced that his girlfriend of 4 years, Elizabeth Pledger Stewart, was cheating on him. She wasn't, but Williams' mind was made up, and there was no convincing him otherwise. He would later tell police that he'd threatened to harm Elizabeth if she didn't stop messing around behind his back. One morning in 2017, Williams decided that she'd gone too far with her alleged infidelity. He ran her car off the road with his van and then shot Elizabeth repeatedly in cold blood. The victim died from her injuries, and Williams was charged with murder. After 2 years of court proceedings, he pleaded guilty to stalking and killing Pledger Stewart. During the first of what would become 2 sentencing hearings, Pledger Stewart's sons, 23-year-old Jerome Stewart and 30-year-old Anthony Deese, charged at Williams. The attack came seemingly out of nowhere, catching the entire courtroom off guard as Deese and Stewart's sister prepared to read a victim impact statement. One of the brothers jumped over a table while the other ran around it. The brothers took Williams to the ground and punched him repeatedly while court officers tried to separate the fight, which ended after one of the men was tased. They were both held in contempt of court and jailed for 30 days on charges of assault and obstructing official business. Williams was taken to the hospital for his injuries and was back in the courtroom a week later for a second sentencing hearing. He was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. Mahoning County Sheriff Jerry Green told NBC News that he understands how emotions can run high in a courtroom, but that fighting is unacceptable. 8. J. Person Lin. Prominent California attorney J. Person Lin had been practicing law for over a decade and had been involved with some high-profile cases when he got into a troubling dispute with the court bailiff in 2019. He had gone on to the San Bernardino courthouse on his day off to deal with routine business that he thought could be handled by the court clerk, but was directed to the courtroom to address the matter. Because Person Lin didn't expect to go before a judge that day, he was wearing everyday clothing rather than the crisp suit and tie that he normally wore in court. A deputy told him to sit in the gallery area of the courtroom, where non-attorneys usually wait to address their cases. Person Lin explained that he was an attorney, and the deputy instructed him to speak with the bailiff. Instead of listening to what Person Lin was trying to say, the bailiff told him to stay out of the part of the courtroom that was reserved exclusively for attorneys. Once again, he explained that he was an attorney and that he was there to discuss a case. He reached into his back pocket to grab his wallet and show the staff members his bar ID, but before he could do that, an officer pushed him out of the attorney-only area. Courtroom footage appears to show the officer putting his hand on Person Lin's chest. The attorney would later tell the ID series Chaos in Court that it was the first time anyone had ever shoved or grabbed him in a courtroom. He continued trying to explain to the deputies why he was in court, but was told to leave. Court officers were seen escorting Person Lin out of the courtroom and out of the camera's view. In an audio recording of the conversation, Person Lin could be heard giving a deputy the number of the case he was trying to deal with. By then, he was understandably frustrated, and he minced no words while telling the staff that they screwed up and that he planned to legally come after them for the way they treated him. Just moments later, one of the deputies tased him. Person Lin was charged with obstructing an officer in the performance of his duty. He was sentenced to a year of probation. The deputy who tackled him was not charged for excessive force, but some believe that he should have been. A judge accused Person Lin of escalating the situation, but he was left feeling suspicious that he was treated differently because of his race. 7. Taylor's Sha Business. In early 2022, a mother came home to find her son, 25-year-old Shad Therian, dismembered and scattered throughout the basement of their Green Bay, Wisconsin home. Police identified the last person Shad was with as 24-year-old Taylor Sha Business and tracked her down. They found more of Shad's body parts in her van. Sha Business reportedly admitted to using methamphetamine with the victim before the murder. She claimed that she snapped and blacked out and couldn't remember what happened during the violent episode. Authorities charged her with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and assault. Given the horrific nature of the crime and the young woman's behavior, her mental health has landed at the center of her court proceedings. During a competency hearing in early 2023, Sha Business's court-appointed attorney, Quinn Jolly, asked the judge to reschedule the session so the defense could have extra time to review the case. Something about Jolly's request apparently sent Sha Business into a rage. She charged at her lawyer and elbowed him in the head. A nearby court deputy wrestled her to the ground and she was removed from the courtroom. Despite her erratic behavior, the judge found Sha Business competent to stand trial and granted Jolly's request to withdraw from the case. 6. Wesley Thomas. 19-year-old Michael Roark was a U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Stewart in Georgia when he joined an anti-government militia of disgruntled soldiers who called themselves Forever Enduring and Always Ready, or FEAR. Formed in 2011, the extremist group had some extremely heinous crimes on its agenda, including assassinating then-President Barack Obama, blowing up major dams, launching deadly chemical attacks, infiltrating the drug trade, and doing other things to take down the federal government. At some point, Roark began dating a young woman named Tiffany York, and his involvement in FEAR lessened as he focused on his new relationship. He also made plans to leave the military, causing the group to worry that he would rat them out to authorities. To prevent that from happening, 4 FEAR members lured Michael and Tiffany into the woods by inviting them on a hunting trip. After getting the couple into a remote area, the renegade soldiers ambushed them with gunfire, fatally shooting them both. Christopher Salmon, Anthony Peden, Isaac Agwigwi, and Michael Burnett were charged with murder. During a pre-trial hearing for Anthony Peden, who was accused of firing the shots that killed Tiffany, the young woman's stepfather Wesley Thomas lost control of his emotions and lunged at the defendant. It took 4 court officers to take him to the ground and handcuff him. In the meantime, Roark's father shouted out in Thomas's defense, reminding the court that he was a father who just lost a child. When the officers lifted Thomas to his feet, one of them patted him on the chest as if to let him know that he understood why Thomas was upset, but he had to do his job and maintain order in the court. Peden, Christopher Salmon, and Isaac Agwigwi were all sentenced to life in prison for murder, while Burnett received an 8-year sentence for reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation against the other 3. Courtroom chaos broke out again during Christopher Salmon's sentencing hearing, when he tried to say he was sorry for his actions. Unwilling to entertain the apology, a member of Roark's family yelled at him to shut up, but he obeyed the judge's command for order in the court, and that was the end of his outburst. 5. Robert Fleck. During a DUI hearing in Jefferson County, Kentucky in 2014, Assistant District Attorney Robert Fleck got into an argument with the defendant's lawyer. Just months earlier, he had been suspended for 30 days for threatening a public defender. Upon returning to work, he'd signed a zero-tolerance agreement promising to keep his behavior under control. Clearly, that didn't last. The DUI hearing spun out of control as Fleck belittled the defense attorney, calling him "buddy boy" and shouting over him as he tried to argue his case to the court. Fleck repeatedly ignored the judge's orders to maintain his composure as he devolved into a diatribe about how disrespected and insulted he felt by his rookie opponent. Frustrated with the unprofessional behavior, the judge called a recess and ordered for the hearing to resume later that day. That was unacceptable to Fleck, who had lunch plans with his mother. As the courtroom cleared out, he stood at the microphone and droned incredulously about how the recess was causing him to stand up his 83-year-old mother. The judge refused to entertain the argument and reiterated that court would resume that afternoon at 1:00 p.m. Fleck said that, "For the record, I think this is BS," and stormed out of the courtroom. After having a little while to cool down, he apologized to the court for his outburst, explaining that he couldn't bear the thought of his mother showing up for lunch and him not being there as promised. But he continued to blame the defense attorney for his behavior, so the judge cut him off and told him to either apologize or don't apologize. he apologized and was probably lucky that the judge didn't hold him in contempt. After hearing about the incident, Fleck's bosses decided that enough was enough and fired him. He now practices on the other side of the aisle as a criminal defense attorney. 4. Donald Byrd. While working as a strip club security guard in Miami in 2012, Lukachi Kendall approached two unarmed African-American men who were sitting in a vehicle and opened fire on them, killing Kijwan Byrd and leaving Michael Smathers paralyzed from the waist down. Kendall argued in court that he shot the victims in self-defense based on Florida's Stand Your Ground law. But even in a state that gives gun owners unusually wide parameters for pulling the trigger in the name of self-defense, Kendall's claims seemed outrageous. Not only did the evidence show that the victims desperately tried to take cover while Kendall relentlessly sprayed them with bullets, he had a criminal record and a troubling history of mentally unstable behavior. He'd been kicked out of the Navy and certainly had no business working as an armed security guard. Throughout his court proceedings, Kendall was examined by multiple mental health experts who concluded that he was competent to stand trial. When his pre-trial hearing finally rolled around in 2014, 2 years after the murder, several of the victims' relatives were there, including Kijwan Byrd's father, Donald. During the hearing, Kendall's defense attorney argued that his client should be kept under observation at a local mental hospital. Outraged by the mere suggestion, Donald Byrd began yelling about how Kendall belonged in prison. He accused the defendant of playing crazy and rose from his seat while family members and a court officer tried to calm him down. The anguish in Donald's voice was heart-wrenching, and his heightened emotion was understandable, considering the fact that he lost a son to senseless violence, and that Kendall reacted to his outburst by smirking. But a courtroom demands order, and the grieving father had to be removed when he didn't stop yelling. Thankfully, Donald ultimately got his wish. Kendall was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 3. Jeremy Shue. After suffering from a number of strokes, 39-year-old Jeremy Shue was left with limited use of his legs and arms. In early 2020, he was rolled into an Ann Arbor, Michigan courtroom in a wheelchair to face a slew of felony charges for a series of home and vehicle break-ins, as well as a drug possession charge. During the hearing, Shue's attorney filed a motion to recuse the judge, David Schwartz, because he felt as though the judge had treated his client unfairly in the past. This type of request is typically granted in cases where a defense attorney can successfully argue that a judge has a bias against the defendant. But Shue's attorney failed to convince the court that his client would get a fairer shake under another judge, and the motion was denied. In response, the defense attorney asked to be withdrawn from the case, most likely so Shue couldn't accuse him of ineffective counsel, and for another lawyer to be assigned to help his client. Schwartz denied the attorney's request, at which point Shue asked to represent himself. In response, the judge told Shue that he thinks representing himself was a foolish idea. Shue said, "That's your opinion," and the judge responded, "That's fine, you don't have to buy my opinion." By then, it was obvious based on Shue's escalating tone that he was becoming increasingly frustrated. He continued to challenge Schwartz, who remained impressively calm and gave Shue permission to represent himself. The judge set a trial date, and Shue instantly became angry because he didn't think it gave him enough time to prepare his case. Schwartz basically told him that he had no say in the matter and reiterated the planned trial date. Despite being in a severely weakened physical state due to his health problems, Shue was so overcome with rage that he managed to muster enough strength to flip over the defense table. Court officers pushed him back down into his wheelchair and removed him from the courtroom. To add to his growing list of legal problems, Shue was held in contempt of court on a $50,000 bond. 2. Peter Haer. 30-year-old Peter Haer was accused of stealing $51,000 worth of jewelry from a big box store in Scott County, Kentucky in 2008. In a scene that sounds like it came straight out of an action movie, he allegedly broke into the store through its HVAC system in the middle of the night and slid down a rope onto the sales floor. He was charged with third-degree burglary and criminal mischief and faced up to 5 years in prison if convicted. During a court hearing, Haer asked the judge to replace his court-appointed attorney, Doug Crickmer. He accused Crickmer of failing to provide adequate representation, while Crickmer told the judge that Haer expected things that the court wasn't willing to provide, including a lesser sentence than what had been offered to him as part of a plea deal. The attorney later told the ID channel series Chaos in Court that it tried to negotiate in Haer's favor, but the prosecution was unwilling to budge and Haer blamed him for it. Much to Haer's dismay, the judge denied his request. It's clear based on courtroom footage that the defendant was about to boil over with anger. After brewing for a few moments, as if to contemplate his next move, Haer punched Crickmer in the face full force and knocked him to the ground. He continued to beat the attorney, while most of the court staff stood around dumbfounded. There was only one officer in the courtroom at the time, so the judge hit the panic button. By the time deputies flooded into the room and apprehended Haer, Crickmer was seriously injured. He told Chaos in Court that he had no memory of what happened between the moment he noticed Haer's fist heading toward his face and when he woke up in the hospital. Crickmer opted not to press charges against Haer, but he was done acting as his attorney. In the end, the situation worked out for Haer, who finally got his wish and received a new lawyer. But the judge was less forgiving than Crickmer over the assault and sentenced the defendant to 6 months in jail for contempt of court. 1. Marco Pereira. Just days before Christmas in 2014, police officer Charles Condek was shot dead while responding to a noise complaint at an apartment building in Tarpon Springs, Florida. The killer, Marco Pereira, had been released from prison just 9 months earlier for other crimes and was on parole at the time of the shooting. The complaint that Condek was responding to had nothing to do with Pereira, and the officer was sadly just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the suspect fled the scene in a stolen car, he ran over the dying cop. Pereira had a lengthy criminal history, so people understandably found it hard to believe he was being sincere when he expressed remorse for his actions. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and the case went to a jury to decide whether he would receive the death penalty or spend the rest of his life in prison. At the beginning of his sentencing hearing, Pereira apologized to Condek's family and begged the jury to spare his life. After deliberating for 5 hours, the jury came back with their decision and handed their paperwork to the judge, who looked it over and announced that Pereira would be sentenced to death. Relieved sighs could be heard throughout the courtroom, but when the judge checked the sheet showing the jurors' individual verdicts, he noticed that 2 of them had voted against the death penalty. In Florida, a jury must be unanimously in support for the death penalty in order for it to be imposed. The jury foreman had checked the wrong box on the paperwork. After catching the mistake, the judge announced that Pereira would spend life in prison, generating happy reactions from his family and utter dismay from pretty much everyone else in the courtroom. Condek's loved ones sobbed loudly as they broke down from what felt like the cruelest blow of injustice yet. Unfortunately, nothing could be done to change the outcome of the case, leaving them with no other choice than to find ways to cope with the decision and carry on with their lives.
Do you think courts should be able to sentence teen killers to life without parole? Or do you think that it's only right to give young people the possibility of seeing freedom again someday? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.